Well, welcome to the opening plenary of the Juvenile Justice track at the conference this year. My name is Shea Bilchik. I am the Center Director at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University's Public Policy Institute. I'm also part of the steering committee of the National Reentry Resource Center, and I chair the Juvenile Justice Advisory Group of that entity. So I am particularly pleased to be part of this opening session, to be part of the conference, and to be part of the overall effort that's being made on improving reentry for juvenile offenders as well as adult offenders across this country. I'm in great company today in terms of this session, and I'll introduce our panelists. But I'm also in great company in terms of the members of our Juvenile Justice Advisory Group, in terms of the staff at CSG through the Justice Policy Center and the National Reentry Resource Center under the leadership of Leanne Duran, the guidance of Leah Kane, who many of you know, and just a bunch of great people. I'll have an opportunity to make some opening comments before we move into the panel, but I just want to thank everybody who's been involved in this work, not just about the conference, but the work supporting it through the center and the work that you all are doing in your communities around the country in helping us get better at how we work with our young people, those young people who have gone into placement and are returning back into our communities. I don't think it's a stretch for me to say that the dialogue around reentry, aftercare, has been part of the lexicon in juvenile justice perhaps longer than it has been around adult criminal justice. One of our panelists, David Altshuler, started working on aftercare probably 20, 25 years ago already. He was 4 inches taller, didn't have any gray on his head or his beard, but really began to frame a lot of the issues that we talk about today, I think really, David, honestly, with a lot less knowledge than, not that you were a bag of hot air at the time, but a lot less knowledge then than what we have now. And largely to your credit and Troy Armstrong and others to build that knowledge base of what we know now it can be more successful. That work that was done in the early years was not bad work. It was good work. It was about how do we provide the kind of supervision that young people might need as they re-enter back into their communities. It was about how we reconnect them to school or job training. It was how we give them the kind of supports they might need, whether they would be supports in relation to mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment. I mean, I think our framing at the time was pretty sound. I think if I look back at it, however, and question, so if we had the basic frame correct, and I don't think we really had it completely correct, and we'll talk about that today, why weren't we as successful as we should have been? Where were we failing in undertaking this work? So I have some thoughts about that, and the thoughts are that one of the flaws was that we used a set of operating assumptions about how we would do this work that were to some degree flawed. And our increasing knowledge base today allows us to understand maybe what some of those operating assumptions were that we could get better at that would then lead to some of those other activities being more successful. So today's panel will really explore the elements of a strong reentry or aftercare process or planning and the challenges associated with reentry in today's world. What is the operating assumptions? What are they that I'm talking about? One is that workforce capacity and the workforce that we have in place. So how do we train our workforce? What is it we're training them to do in working with young people? I think that has changed dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years. In the last 5 years, it's changed dramatically, partially because we know more about what we should be training our workforce in relation to what they do as opposed to what we believed 5, 10, 15 years ago. Second, I think, is the need to strengthen our engagement to families and other supportive adults in the lives of our young people, to see them as a key resource in working with them successfully as opposed to potentially a negative force. And I think in my 33 years of doing this work, I know I look much too young to be doing this for 33 years. I hear that all the time. What I've seen is a change in more of a strength-based approach and using kind of an asset framing around what we do not misguiding ourselves into believing that our families don't have weaknesses and things we need to work on and help them strengthen, but just that they also bring a lot of strengths, and they may be the best experts we have in most instances of how best to work with their young people. The need to stay engaged around education, both during the period of incarceration and after incarceration. I think that continuum approach, and I know some of you in this room are really trying to create this continuum framing, is really important. And the need to recognize and plan for the transitions into adulthood. If your systems locally or at the state level are anything like the ones that I'm familiar with, you have an increasingly older population you're working with. So you're not only talking about reentry back into the community, you're talking about transitions into adulthood while you're reentering into the community. And if you have kids, like I've had kids who are now into their late 20s, you know that the developmental supports that young people need don't end when they magically turn 18 and are adults within our definitions in our society. That this period of 18 to 25 is one we really need to be planful of, even if we don't have jurisdiction over the kids through that age period. And we'll talk about some of that. So it's some of that thinking that has infused the work of our National Reentry Resource Center around juvenile justice issues, the work of our advisory group, and the kinds of things that we want to do to support not just the grantees as demonstration grantees, as mentoring grantees, but the broader field out there, those that didn't get funded and did get funded, and how to view this work and do this work a bit differently. And I know there are other issues that I didn't touch on around basic health and housing and other things, but we'll get to those as well during the panel. So it's that framing, those assumptions, that led to the construction of this panel. And so I'm hopeful that in our discussion today, which is really designed not to present a group of individuals who will come up here and say, let me tell you how we did it and why this is the best way to do it, and this is what you should do, but to identify key issues, challenges, and opportunities, and some successes around how to look at this work across the range of issues that I've just talked about. So with that, let me introduce our panel. And I'll just kind of go down the line here, starting at the opposite end. David Altshuler is a principal research scientist at the Institute for Policy Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He is known, I think, most nationally for his work in the Intensive Aftercare Project funded by OJJDP, a variety of articles and projects that he's been involved in. I think if we identify just a cadre of few key people that have really helped to build our knowledge and understand the key elements that are necessary, David really is at the forefront of that group. He's critically involved in the NRC and as well as the Department of Labor reentry grants. And I'm delighted to be able to work with David and as a researcher and as someone on the ground in many communities, David, delighted you're part of the panel. Lonnie Jackson is a director of the statewide Office of Minority Services at the Oregon, I got that right, Oregon.
Got it.
Oregon. Oregon Youth Authority. There's a lot of pride in Oregon. And I'm corrected constantly when I get that wrong. But Lonnie has been involved in, as you can hear from his title, issues around minority youth and reentry issues, but has really been a rock-solid piece of the Oregon Youth Authority in relation to community justice and what we do in the community for young people. And so he's going to bring both the reentry and the minority youth perspective on how do we craft approaches, what are the issues and challenges we face with a diverse population of young people, and how to get that right. Judge Denise Cubbin is from Lucas County, Ohio. That's Toledo, Ohio. She's been on the bench since 2004 and the administrative judge in Toledo since 2007. Prior to that, she was a prosecutor for 20-some years. And,
Thank you.
And really has been an innovator, not just during her years as a prosecutor, which I think, and I was a prosecutor in my background, which oftentimes is a learning curve for us in how to get it right. So I don't know about the judge, but I've been in recovery for a long time. and I'm just figuring out how to balance some of my old perspectives on punishment and accountability with more of a developmental approach. And I think Judge Cubbin has really done some outstanding work on both the dependency and delinquency side in understanding youth development and the kind of supports that young people need. And she'll be talking about this work from a judicial lens. And oftentimes people look at this and say, well, my jurisdiction, the judges commit the kids and then they're done. And we're going to challenge that notion in terms of some of this work. Carol Shapiro is the Associate Research Scholar at Columbia University. Many of you might know Carol from her community work in New York and the way that has kind of trickled out nationally, probably even more forcefully than trickled out, pushed out nationally. La Bodega de la Familia and Family Justice Institute were really Carol's babies, and she brings a real strong orientation about how to bridge this disconnect we often see between community, family, and then our institutions and our formal systems. So I'm delighted that Carol is part of this discussion as well. And then right to my left is Bob Gerlach, who is the Transition Services Manager at the New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department. Bob had a long career in this department, eventually became the Deputy Superintendent of Operations, retired, and then came back really to form this new effort in New Mexico around how to do a better job around transitioning youth, and has developed some mechanisms and some operating premises around that work that I think you'll find interesting. Again, our goal today is not to sit up here and say, here's some solutions. Our goal today is to have a conversation with everybody in this room about the challenges we're facing, the opportunities that are presented, and some of the ideas that might help promote better outcomes for young people. So consider this kind of a town hall forum type discussion, okay? We've limited our panelists to no more than 5 to 7 minutes of opening thoughts and observations about the work that they do. Then we're going to open it up for the next hour or so for just a discussion. And so get ready to jump into this dialogue, because I did not come with 30 questions in case no one volunteers with the first question. I'll wait you out, okay? All right, so we're going to start immediately to my left with Bob Gerlach. So we're going to move from institution to community, to judicial, and then to David, if I remember correctly the order we decided upon. Okay, Bob.
I'm looking a little bit the history of my facility stuff. As deputy superintendent, there was no reentry for my position. My position is that we kick kids out the doors. I don't have beds. We look at safety. We really, if I have to put a kid on a bus to send him back to his hometown, that's what we did 7, 8 years ago when I was there. There wasn't anything else. We said, you're on community supervised release, you're going to report to your JPO, you're going to have all these little tasks you need to do. You may, if you do technical violations, such as don't go to school, you come back with a positive drug test, you do all these things, you're going to come back to our facility. That was our mentality 7, 8 years ago in New Mexico, which is a very short time ago. Where we started to really look at this transitioning piece and looking at what our recidivism rate in New Mexico is high, extremely high. We were looking at, off the top of my head, 80% of our kids leaving facilities and either coming back or graduating to adult systems. That was totally unacceptable to the state. So 4 years ago, we started really looking at how do we start really working with some of these youth, realizing that we have a lot of systems in New Mexico that are under silos. We have departments, we have individuals, we have departments within facilities that are in silos that only work within themselves and don't share information, don't look for the good of the kid, or the youth. I'm sorry, if I say kid, correct me, because it's youth. I'm still working on that one. So how do we get all those people really to pull together and start looking for the common good in a ton of different domains? So when we started looking at how do we impact kids, how do we get youth voice, we didn't do youth voice. If you look at our MDT process, and let's say this was my panel, and I was the youth, I would have Shay saying, well, you're going to go to school. You're not doing well. I would have David saying, you're going to behavioral health counseling. Whether you need it or not, I say you do. So youth voice was not there. Family voice was not there. So we started looking at our transition process and developing those within the facility. We really started looking at how do we do that, because we have a philosophy in the facilities. We have, lack of a better term, a correctional mentality. People in those facilities are in their own micro-communities. I was there. I had my micro-community. Things did not go out of the micro-community in facilities. So when we looked at what was the best approach to try to do that, we looked at really how do we get outside people that aren't connected to facilities, aren't connected to departments, aren't connected to child welfare, behavioral health, DVR services, anything else that may be out there. So we really created this little organization that was kind of just way out here, that wasn't connected to anything, but had to know and interact with all of them. Now, what did that do? That prevented a lot more challenges for us, especially getting into facilities, because now we had to break into the systems of behavioral health, the classification officers, the security staff, the educational staff. And what we've seen a lot of this of is we see silos in a lot of our facilities, and we see silos outside of our facilities with some of our community service providers. So we had to bring in a set of people that had to learn all those systems and develop relationships with all those systems to support those youth. So we looked at it really as we need to really advocate. And the biggest thing is we're going to give you a hand up. We're not going to give you a hand out. We're going to open doors for you. I have one scenario when we first started. We had a youth, and we set him up, and he had a great program coming out of the facility and everything. And he went over and says, you need to go over and meet this person, you know, be responsible and do this. The first person he met at the door says, well, you're a juvenile justice kid, we don't serve you. When we had already talked to the director and said, we do. 5 minutes later, my transition coordinator was at the facility saying, why aren't you serving this youth? Because he needs services. He's at risk over there. So that kind of interaction with the youth and with the community service, with all the different domains, becomes really critical for a lot of these. Because we know juvenile probation's over here looking at technical violations. Okay, you have counseling, don't show up, and I'm going to be filing a warrant for your arrest to get you locked back up tomorrow. What we try to look at in reentry is we need to treat a lot of these things as them not knowing. They've been under-socialized. They don't know how to access some of these systems and stuff. But also that there's somebody there that they can rely upon. So as we look at transition really starts the first day a kid hits that facility. It can't be later on. It can't be 6 months, 3 months. And what we've really tried to do is we really need to try to develop that relationship, that transition coordinator, or that single person who the youth is saying, okay, you're not my JPO, so you're not going to be holding the hammer over my head. You're not going to be sitting there saying, I'm just waiting for you to mess up. Because we have some of that in New Mexico. We have some people that think that they should have been cops over there, because that's what they do. So we're slowly transitioning that mentality. So that mentality throughout the state has to transition as a whole. So we really start looking at reentry. We start looking at the very beginning. We start looking at a lot of the domains that these youth need. So as we keep on going, that relationship continues with that youth, because once they get back out in the community, then we have more barriers to fight with them and help them with to get them more involved, to keep them involved, to keep them engaged. So the relationship from the facility into the community, into those service providers, and then if we have problems, treating things as a relapse and not as a technical violation.
So Bob, when we come back to you, I want to hit on the issues of culture change.
Yep.
Because I venture to say some of you in the audience may be dealing with a workforce that's going, what do you mean I'm being trained in motivational interviewing or cognitive behavioral therapy? You know, this is not what I was trained to do in corrections. Right. This is my new world. So when we come back for the discussion, I want to hear about those challenges you had to face in getting there. And maybe Lonnie, as you talk about what's going on in Oregon, you can talk about some of that culture shift in the facilities and how challenging it is.
Mm-hmm. And it's really a pleasure and honor to be here today and kind of share with you a little bit about what Oregon is doing to address reentry issues. And I'm kind of at that place where I have experience, I guess, in both. I started my career in the institutions, and I still have programs that are running in the institution, and I'm also involved and an advocate for work in terms of that continuum back into the community. Quick personal history about myself. Originally, I'm from Los Angeles. I grew up in South Central LA. And the only reason I say that is because I very easily could have been a part of the system myself. I had friends, family that became involved in the system, and I was fortunate and blessed to have an opportunity to go to college in Oregon. And I will tell you, that's the biggest culture shock I ever had in my life. You know what, when I got to Oregon, I know I got to be brief because Shay gonna hold me to the table, but I got to tell you, I grew up idolizing the Trojans and, you know, the Bruins. And I always said, you know, ducks and beavers, that's kind of weak names. I mean, who's going to get scared of the ducks and the beavers when we play them? But when I got to Oregon, I said, you know, all the rain and the weather, you know, that's appropriate names. But really, really, my journey started, I never planned on making a career in corrections. After I got out of college, I went to a private school in Salem. And after I got out of college, I started working at the largest correctional facility in Oregon, McLaren Youth Correctional Facility. And I started the first 2 years and liked working with young people, particularly with my background. But I'm going to tell you, and I thought Oregon was even back then. I ain't going to tell you how long I've been there because I always keep my age on the down low and stuff. But after working a long time, not a long time, my first few years there, Oregon, I thought, had some progressive programs even at that time. You know, drug and alcohol. We had some work with violent offenders. We had some reality therapy type programs. But generally, I was really tuning into our minority populations, and we started seeing more and more youth get committed. And a lot of that mentality I recognized because the gang stuff hit us in Oregon back in the mid-'80s. It really started coming into the system. And I really felt, even though these youth were involved in these other programs, you know, we're really missing the boat in terms of with this population. I felt there were really a lot of them involved with that lifestyle and mentality about seeing no options but being involved in gangs. And then I felt a lot of our youth were disconnected from their culture. A lot of them really didn't understand, value, and appreciate the sacrifices, accomplishments of their culture. Long story short, you know, sometimes we could all sit there and yell, we need to do something. Finally, someone said, well, why don't you know, kind of do it instead of complaining? And that was the emphasis for us to develop the Minority Youth Concerns Program at the time. And really what we really do is really, again, try to help youth see options. You know, we're not just options, but really help break down a lot of the mentality that got them involved in gangs. I think part of the challenge in the facilities is, back when I first started, it was more of a one-size-fits-all type approach. I think now we've really gotten more into the individualized, you know, type of approach in terms of working with young people. I think another huge issue that has risen up is the whole DMC. Some guys are familiar with that, disproportionate minority contact. That's a crisis. I'm sure here people that work with our population of youth, that is really a crisis that's going on in this country. I think the core requirement that OJJDP came up with years ago for states to begin addressing that, I think happened under your administration, Shay?
Before, but
I know Shay provided a lot of leadership, and David with IAP has done a lot of work to advocate that in terms of reentry. So basically, I've done a lot of work to help youth. I think in corrections, we have a unique opportunity because youth are in a structured environment to incorporate education, information, to help them see options, and to help them develop hope that there are ways that they can re-enter the community and be productive citizens. My next level of frustration was back then when youth that I felt really were clicking and wanting to change got back into the community. Well, they go back to the same community a lot of times, didn't have support around employment, education. The field wasn't communicating with the facility. And so I saw a lot of disconnects, and we were losing a lot of young people that I felt had opportunities to be successful. And so a lot of my work now is both in the facilities to continue to work with programs, best practice, helping youth see options, but we lose our investment if we don't have those collaborative partnerships when they come back in. We have to engage families, and I know Carol's going to talk a lot about it, but we got to be, a lot of times families, it's tough because the kid is locked up, been a problem in the community, and it's hard to sometimes get them because sometimes they got to inherit distrust of government, etc. There's a lot of work we got to do, but I think the reality of it is we got to see the benefits of having families involved with case planning. I think we got to engage the community a lot more. We got to get more minority communities involved. I think tribes, you know, we do a lot of work with the tribes. We have MOUs with 7 of our 9 federally recognized tribes to work with youth while they're in the facility and helping when they get back out in the community. I have a lot of information, but I want to stay true to my timeline. But that's just a little bit of background about some of the work that I've been able to be involved in with a lot of others. It's tough work. There's a lot of challenges, but there are also some real positive and innovative things that are going on.
Thanks, Lonnie. I think when we come back for the discussion for both Bob and Lonnie, there's an issue about how you structure some of that work. Right. So how do you create your teaming? Is it multidisciplinary teams? Right. Is it team decision making? Does it model family group conferencing? How do you actually create structure right. and process as opposed to simply in the training you're supposed to do these things? Right. So we'll come back to that, but that's great lead-in on some of the institutional challenges. And my comments just foreshadowed what you're going to hear now from
Kel Shapiro.
Good morning. How are you all?
Good morning.
So how many of you are parents? So a fair number of you. So I'm going to talk about the opportunities that I think we're facing with the Second Chance Act first before I get into the challenges. One is the idea and the notion that people are connected to families and communities are intuitive. Would you agree? Mm-hmm. So we have natural connections. We have cultural connections. So I think one of the great opportunities, which really piggybacks off of, some of Bob's remarks about getting the voice, we can be very conscientious about engaging the voice of the youth and their families and their natural connections. So I think the opportunity is there. Families are 24-hour. Who knows first when somebody is screwing up? Do you think it's the best well-meaning service or a probation officer or an institutional worker? Who do you think knows best? Family, a girlfriend, a friend, a peer. Could be any number of ways that we think about defining it. So I think that's something we really ought to think about. Secondly, families and social networks are there and free, which brings me to my next point, and that is, and this is both like an opportunity and a challenge. Many of the youth that are returning home are coming back to families and communities where there are multiple members involved in many systems. Child welfare, for example, public housing, welfare, parole, probation. So think for a second about your own family, particularly those of you who have kids. Can you imagine if there's all these sets of mandated conditions by all of those agencies? What might that do? How would you feel if somebody was coming into your home, knocking on your door, saying, you have to go to parenting classes for the adult? The leaseholder, you can't have your son come home from prison here, right? The probation officer requiring other things and child welfare others. So the opportunity I see here, and I think it was really echoed by the Deputy Attorney General at the federal level, is we can look at how we use our resources, both funding, staff development, to think of the family and the community as the unit of analysis at the nexus of these issues. And I think that's a tremendous, in a really bad economy, how do we think about, the justice reinvestment, only if it's even broader, right? When you think about mental health and addiction. So I think that's a tremendous opportunity we have. I also think, and this is, again, I feel like my mind is always split between opportunities and challenges, is that we do have an existing workforce. We have a lot of people, both at the community level, at the institutional level, really committed to these youth and their families and the communities in which they're coming from. Having worked, my first job, by the way, was at Lorton. It no longer exists. In 1978, I worked at YC2, 18 to 26-year-olds. Anyone want to guess what I did? I think I beat you. I started pre-release in 1978 because there was no programming for these youth to go home. So part of what I've learned in the course of working in jails and prisons with parole and probation is they are often treated, the officers, we talked about motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral this and whatever the flavor du jour is, how often are you asked about your expertise, or me, or any of us, right? How do we tap and model the expertise of the staff and people working diligently in all of these places so that we can do the same and mirror that for engaging youth and their families? So I think the work, I'm a big fan of Aretha Franklin about RESPECT, and I think we have not done a good enough job respecting the people who really started out in this field to help people. So I think that's a tremendous opportunity. And I think I'm going to stop there because I know there'll be other questions. But the challenges we face were already alluded to in that we have a culture and a funding stream and a research stream that looks at individuals, looks at individual outcomes. And when I think about the neighborhoods, communities, tribes most affected by involvement in our juvenile and adult systems, it's just not a democracy. And we really have to think about how we can reach them better, how we can treat the staff better to reach them better, and how we can measure outcomes that actually take into account the ability to leverage social capital and not just focus on deficits, pathologies, criminogenic needs. So I guess my last comment is the issue of language. I've had 2 boys. I have a nephew who's been a heroin addict. Labeling of youth is a tragedy. And what that does also to their families is it demonizes and disempowers the families. So I would urge us that one of the biggest challenges we're facing is to think about how we talk about the population we're talking about, how we do so with respect, and how we try and employ those same techniques with the staff and communities we're working with. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Carol. Some great observations from all the panelists thus far. I think the last notion that you introduced about the kind of differential in power is an interesting one, because it kind of cascades up or down, however you look at it, between the family and youth to the staff and then to our next panelist, the judge. So, if the court pleases, and would care to make some comments, I'm always fascinated about the power of the bench, both on and off the bench, and then how that power is wielded and utilized in a constructive way. And I think, in my 30-some years in practice as a lawyer, never on the bench, I've watched this transcending type of event take place where judges understand my world isn't just on the bench, it's on the bench and off the bench. And Judge Cubban's a great example of how to look at that power differential and play it well, not just order it, but play it well. Judge Cubban.
Thank you. First of all, shout out to Ohioans here. Yay! I thought you guys were over there. I see some familiar faces. Are there any judges in the audience? All right. Well, I hope the next time
You're not alone.
Invited back, yeah, I've got one person here, that the room is full of a lot more judges. First of all, I am in recovery as well, Shay, like our speaker today, thinking about back in the late 80s how we in juvenile justice, because I was a juvenile court prosecutor at that time, went down the road of juveniles being mini adults. And we know that that's just not true. So I am now in recovery. I have to tell you that most of my 23 years as a prosecutor, I spent in the juvenile division of the prosecutor's office. I did have a couple stints over in the adult division, and while it was very exciting, believe me, I didn't get a lot of satisfaction for a job well done, because the result was incarceration. And would always go back to this notion that at least in juvenile court, it's a court of hope. And we have hope that our children can change and make those necessary changes in their lives so they can ultimately be productive members of our community. So Lucas County, we have a population of about 463,000 people. We're the 6th largest jurisdiction in the state of Ohio. There are 88 counties. We're one of the big 6, so to speak. And I think they call us the big 6. What they really want to say is one of the jurisdictions that do most of the committing of youth to the Department of Youth Services. When I took the bench at the Department of Youth Service, or in juvenile court, a lot of work had begun in juvenile justice reform in the state of Ohio for a lot of different reasons. A lot of work going on with the University of Cincinnati through Ed Latessa and his people looking at risk factors with the kids and developing assessment tools to better look at what their needs were and how we could deal with them. The Kent State University with Patrick Canary is doing a lot of work on behavioral health and juvenile justice. And dollars were following these studies, which was kind of nice. Also, there was a federal lawsuit that was filed against the Ohio Department of Youth Services, and the result of that litigation was about a $20 million settlement. And really, that kind of came at a time when I took the bench, and unfortunately, it was very beneficial for us in juvenile justice because there were mandates that had to be complied with, and Shay is on the team working on a lot of those programming changes. And then we in Lucas County were very fortunate to be the recipients of a substantial federal grant to look at reentry with kids. So it was kind of like the perfect storm in the good sense for us. So here I am, the judge, and in the state of Ohio, we call sentencing disposition. The purpose of disposition is to provide for the care and development of the children who come before us, and to hold them accountable for their actions when they are adjudicated delinquent of criminal acts, restore the victim, provide rehabilitative efforts, and maintain public safety, and do that with graduated sanctions and incentives. If there are people from Pennsylvania here in particular, you know that's the balanced restorative justice model, and it has been codified. So being a lawyer and a judge, that's my job. We decided to look at our children in reentry, aftercare, because they were falling down quickly within 30 days of the release from the Department of Youth Services or our local facility. It's a state-funded, local-run lockdown facility for felons in our community. We call it YTC, Youth Treatment Center. And when I say falling down and looking at recommitments and reoffending, that's in the tune of like 40 to 60%. That's pretty high. So we, in all of our brilliance, decided that we were going to take one of the best practice models. That would be a specialty court. You probably have drug courts, family courts, sexual offender courts. So we created the reentry court. And we worked with the Department of Youth Services to judicially release children who were qualified for release, bring them into this program, monitor their behavior, engage the parents and such. Okay, I'm here to tell you we miserably failed. Nothing really changed. So we decided that it was time to move to Plan B. We worked with the National Center for Juvenile Justice over in Pittsburgh, brought them in to be our consultants, and boy, they've done a super job. The first thing we did was engage the community, have a conversation with their stakeholders, all the parties who were involved, parents, representatives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, everyone you can imagine, in a very collaborative way to come up with a group decision about how we were going to deal with reentry. And our decision really was, well, first, we know the research says reentry has to begin at the time the child leaves the community. We know that. Well, it has to be more than just a conversation, which we just would have conversations about it. We have to take some action steps, number one. Number two, reentry has to be a process. It's not a program. It has to be a process. And that's a paradigm shift. And that's very, very difficult, believe me. And I know you all know that. So if I am the person who is making these dispositional orders, and if I am going to require people to work hard at developing this process of change, I should probably be participating actively in this process. So I convened this group of stakeholders, and we came up with our process. We developed this notion that we would use a lot of the tools that have been developed in conjunction with Department of Youth Services on a local level. A lot of changes happen in the institutions using cognitive-based therapy, and we had decided in our probation department that we would have a shift in the way we handle children as well. So we are using a lot of their tools and a lot of their procedures like the COG models, EPICs, things like that that I bet you a lot of you have heard about. In our probation department, we're in the process of changing this whole way we are approaching the kids. We have offered our probation officers, because many of these kids have had probation officers, as a constant member of their team. They visit the children at the institution or at YTC, and they're active participants in developing what we call the single plan. Now, I know there's a lot of parents here, and when I talk about the single plan, I always visualized it as, you know, that little piece of paper that your kindergartner would always have pinned to their jacket when they come home to tell you about updates of what's going on. Well, this would be like their single plan, this plan that we would develop with all of these important people in their lives, probation, family, and such, and continue to work on this plan when they go to the institution, whatever their institution would be. And as an aside, we included residential placements as well, and to look at this as their map for making those important changes in their lives. So in doing that, what we've offered for the court is we call them review hearings in Ohio, and you probably have different terminologies for that. Those are the opportunities to be able to review behavior of the parties in a case. This is juvenile court. So 30 days after a child is committed to an institution, in a nutshell, we have a hearing. At that hearing, we bring all the parties together to present the plan. We use technology from the Department of Youth Services through video conferencing to have the child there present as well. And then we use that plan and their progress as a framework for how often they're going to have a review hearing. When they come back to the community, they come to court, we have it kind of a, you know, kids love ceremony, a ceremonial signing or making amendments and affirmation of their case plan services, working toward efforts. As I said, I'm going to give the mic back, but the one thing we have determined is that there really is a need for a local treatment, day treatment facility, some sort of a safe environment to transition these kids into the community in a seamless way that all of these wonderfully smart, brilliant people, we rely on their information to format a day treatment center that's beneficial for everybody. And then I have some other remarks that I'll save for later.
Great, great, thank you. So we have kind of a picture that's been developed here about some type of seamless process, if we get it right, in working with young people and creating a team of individuals for that young person as they come back into the community, and a connecting point back to the community, to the family, and with the youth involvement in the process in a way perhaps we've never done before. So David, in your work that you've done, you kind of frame this as overarching case management, as kind of the structure in which you look at this. And outside of terminology, what's the heart and soul of overarching case management? What are the key elements as you reflect on what you've just heard and what you've learned over the past number of years?
I have some handouts to help in this very brief amount of time that I have.
Do they all have the handouts already?
They're getting them right now.
Okay.
But this does cut into my time, right? So I can't include this. All right. Okay. Because all my colleagues.
You've got 4 minutes left.
Because
I know.
I was telling them it takes me 5 minutes to clear my throat. Give me a break, right? I figure I have 15 seconds for every year that I've been doing this, so you know, maybe give me 20 seconds per year. All right, here's what I'm going to try to pull a lot of strands together, and this issue about overarching case management is very important. But I want to take just a couple of steps, if I may, before I get you there. Okay? And the handouts. I hope there's enough for everybody to have one, but if not, we'll get more made for you. I think you're going to find these helpful in thinking through some of what I'm going to be saying. I'm humbled by what I've learned over the years having done this. And the truth, if truth be known, a number of people sitting right here on this platform have been my mentors. I've learned a lot from them. I've learned a lot from the field. One of the best experiences of my life was being out in the field a lot, talking to kids, meeting with staff, going into facilities, being in the community, talking with judges and probation officers, being out there. And I think that through all of that, I've learned a great deal. And Shay, I think you're right. There were a few things we missed way back when. But there were a whole bunch of things I think we got quite right. We just didn't have a few additional pieces that for some reason it took the evidence base of the last 10 to 15 years to sort of fill in the gaps and the blanks. The first thing I just want to say to you and point out to you is you've got on your first page a definition of reentry. And you may recognize that that definition sounds very much like, if you've ever seen some of my earlier work, the definition I used of aftercare, because I use those terms interchangeably. Years ago, there was no word reentry. I heard it was Jeremy that came up with that terminology, coined the expression. Fantastic for Jeremy. We called it aftercare. And the adage of, aftercare begins at day one being the point at which a decision is made to actually commit a kid, that was very much part and parcel of the notion that we had of aftercare. And we've said many, many times, my colleagues and I, that aftercare is a misnomer, it's a lousy term, we wish we had another term. Great, we now have reentry. Okay? And what we're talking about are really three kinds of tasks and activities. And if you look on the first page of the handout, you'll see that first and foremost, it talks about preparation for reentry into the specific families, Carol,
Thank
families,
you.
right
Thank
there,
you.
right off the bat, into the specific families and communities to which these kids are going to return. And why that's so important is when we talk about reentry, we're not talking about someone in a facility that does a pre-release plan. We're talking about thinking about what happens in facilities in terms of service provision, in terms of the way that kids have contact with others from outside the facility. We're talking about lots of things that go on while that child is in that facility. So anyone who thought in the early days that when we were saying aftercare, we just sort of meant, well, you do some discharge planning in the facility. Nah, that was not right. We never, ever thought that. We knew that we had to utilize the time that these kids were in these out-of-home placements or in these correctional facilities and get the most out of it. That meant we could work with families, we could work with community folks, we could work with the faith-based community, but they had to be a part of the whole effort. That meant we had to bring them in and have contact while these kids were inside. That meant that the services offered inside had to be attached to and set a basis for what was going to happen when these kids, when they went out. So the folks in facilities who thought, why is he picking on me? I thought this was about aftercare. They were wrong. That's when it has to start. So aftercare beginning at day one or reentry beginning at day one, we mean it. It means that the structures and the incentives all have to be in that direction. Because typically institutional mindsets are not about what happens when they leave the place. You want to make sure it's safe, it's sound, it's secure, and hopefully there's no disciplinary problems that draw too much attention. And for God's sakes, don't let anyone get out. Because if you do that, you're in really big trouble. Everything else, hey, that's just cream on the cake. All right? So that's the reason for that first very important definitional point. The second one is making the connections and the arrangements and the linkages very, very early on. Some people use the term in-reach. We hear that a lot. We used to call it backing in. Call it whatever you want. We've got to get people inside. We've got to get family engagement early on. We've got to get service providers from the community beginning to at least interact, if not actually begin to initiate their services on the inside. This is not always popularly received within correctional facilities or within out-of-home placements, because they kind of do what they do, and then it's your turn. And basically, a concept of reentry, in my view, if it goes in that direction, is never going to get the job done. So that's the second part. And the third part of the definition has to do with services and supervision in the community. We already know if all you're going to do is a lot of supervision and monitoring in the community and you're going to fall short on the service provision side, chances are they're not going to be any better off when they went in, and they may be worse off because of things that happened to them when they were on the inside. So it can't just be services and supervision on the outside. If you look at the second slide or handout, what you'll see is a little diagram which is sort of alphanumerically coded. That just means a number and a letter. And what I've tried to do is basically identify the different segments of the continuum that we need to be thinking about from a reentry perspective. What has to happen during stage 1, during stage 2A, some of you have heard this many times before, during stage 2B, 3A, and 3B. And this is important because this is a way for us all to wrap our heads around the notion that there is a continuum, that if reentry is going to begin at day 1, that means what happens in stage 1? What am I doing in the community during stage 1? What am I doing in the facility during stage 1? What's happening in the facility during stage 1? It's inescapable as to what the challenge is going to be because there's no ambiguity about it. This very clearly signifies what you need to focus on. If you look at the next slide, what you'll see is kind of a strange looking thing that's a big old matrix chart, right? And they're columns. Think of those columns as, oh, I don't know, stovepipes maybe? Oh, I don't know, maybe silos, right? That's what we traditionally think of as the silo effect in these columns. What I've done is I've taken the columns and I've put some but not all. Family needs to be in a column. A whole lot of other service type enterprises need to be in columns. And what I've done is I've aligned them in separate columns. And then you'll see in the rows are the stages. So you need to ask yourself in a given stage, what all is everybody doing? Who's involved? When are they involved? How does it all synchronize, or is it a disconnection? Are there some places where there's down and out gaps? It's called gap analysis, where there's nothing at all. Are there some cells that you've got multiple things going on by different people? Is that duplication or is that teamwork, right? So you need to be thinking about it in that way. The last thing I want to just talk about very briefly, and I'm trying to do this quick.
In 1 minute.
I have 1 minute. Okay, 6 seconds on each one of these, no problem. This last slide is about something that I have always called overarching case management. Overarching case management does not mean how you manage an individual case. It is not client-centered, and it's not about you as a PO or a service provider or a tracker managing an individual case. It's how do you build into a reentry approach, into the entire reentry approach, some very important components that you need to think about across all of the stages. So assessment and classification are key. And it's not just assessment about risk and criminogenic need. It's assessment around non-criminogenic need. It's assessment around strength and assets and resiliency. It's very broad-based assessment that's going to give us a lot of information that we're going to use in different ways. And assessment and classification will help us to differentiate who's high need versus who might be high risk and high need. But those who are high need may not be very much at high risk. And that means if someone's high need but low risk for reoffending, you may be at risk for something else. You may be at risk for victimization. You may be at risk for mental health issues down the road a piece. I could go on and on and on. But the point is that we need to think very differently about the reentry type approach that we want to utilize for someone who's high risk but also high need, in contrast to someone who is high need but definitely low risk. We'll be talking more about this in another session, because sometimes who you think is high risk for reoffending is not at high risk for reoffending. And if we don't get that right early on, we're setting ourselves up in terms of what we do and what's going to happen with these young people for failure. We need to think about that. From an individual case planning perspective, what we're talking about, and we've heard some reference to MDTs and getting everybody involved, hard to pull off. The logistics, the practicality, very difficult. We work on this over and over again. You got people that are coming from far away. You don't know about when these things are being scheduled. I mean, I wish I had a nickel every time one of these problems arose in various jurisdictions. It's very difficult logistically to pull off, but it is not impossible if the structure is oriented along the lines that I'm suggesting, where you're very clearly establishing what the protocols are going to be, what the structure is, what the division of labor is going to be, so that family and community perspective can be incorporated into your individualized case planning. That means you're not having a discharge plan formulated by somebody who has no idea what's going on back in the community, or you're not having it formulated by somebody who doesn't have to actually ever get involved in delivering it. The people who deliver it have no say in who's formulating it. So that's that piece. With regard to surveillance and services, what we're talking there about is a combination of both supervision and monitoring on the one hand, and social control measures which are needed for a high risk for reoffending young person, not much at all for a low risk, and how we're going to connect up the service provision piece with the social control pieces. A lot of times one overshadows another, people get mad on either side, and it produces a lot of conflict, and we don't end up doing anything with the kids except for arguing with each other about who did what and who didn't do what. The last point I want to make is about graduated responses. You'll notice I don't use the term graduated sanctions. I use the term graduated responses. Graduated responses means that there is graduated incentives on one side and there's graduated sanctions on the other. We need to figure out a way to have a system where you utilize both graduated incentives and graduated sanctions. I don't even like language, Carol, the use of the term where we call it a graduated sanction system, but oh, we mean incentives. No, I don't think so. When you say graduated sanctions, we all understand what that means, and it doesn't leave a whole lot of room for graduated incentives. So we'll have more of an opportunity to talk about this both now and in some later sessions, and I hope this has at least given you a flavor of sort of how all of these pieces can fit together.
Great, David. You haven't lost your passion for this work? So we've painted a picture about some pieces that maybe we didn't view in the way we view them today 10 or 15 years ago. What's the role of the court, not just in the sentencing, but from that point forward? And Judge Cubbin described some of those stages where the court maintains involvement, including the next working day when that youth comes back into the community, to make sure that team is in place supporting that youth. We've talked about family and building family trust, family engagement. That ties, in my mind, into workforce. How do we change the perspective of workforce and how workforce views family? A lot of the work we do at our center at Georgetown deals with cross-systems youth involved both in child welfare and juvenile justice. This notion around family engagement, family respect, permeates child welfare, it permeates juvenile justice. In many ways, it permeates our educational system for the kids who aren't succeeding in the families are trying to engage around building successful educational patterns. And I could go on. But how do you change the paradigm, so to speak, someone used that frame, and what are the challenges in doing that? I'd like that to be our discussion for the next 45 minutes and engage the audience in, you've heard some things up here, and they sound great as principles, as values, but how do you get to them? How do you engage the families? How do you change the perspective of your staff?
Three things that I see are issues. One is substance abuse issues. Most of the kids, even though they're court mandated not to smoke weed, they're smoking weed. The other one is mental health issues. And the last one is very, very, very unstable home environments in which, you know, maybe a lot of this stuff started. Okay, so how do we deal with those issues? And then when do we start talking about, we talk a lot about pre-release, but when do we start talking about pre-arrest? And when do we start looking at motivational interviewing, behavioral health in high schools to sort of drop these numbers down? Because the way we're going now, we will have different ways of solving the issues for kids who are going in, but how do we stop the flow of them coming in?
Okay, great points. So I'll turn to the panel to talk about this connect or disconnect that may happen around substance abuse treatment, mental health services in the facility, and then the continuity of care notion of what we need to do to make sure it's bridged within the community. Then I want to tie that secondly to the premise you said about they're smoking weed. And then how do you deal with that? I was in Florida last week for 3 days. The deputy director of the state agency told me, how many people in Florida in the room? 30%, I was told by Rex Huberman, 30% of the state institutional population in juvenile justice are there on misdemeanors, which means they're there on violations, which means a lot of those were smoking weed. They ticked off a probation officer, parole officer, or a judge. So, comments from the panel. Lonnie? Robert?
Well, I think a lot of it is in your perspective, because we still have a big philosophy out there that these are technical violations instead of looking at them as relapse. And what we do is we really need to look at is if they are in an SNA program someplace, is that working? Or is there another program out there that better fits this youth needs? One where they were made connect with. May it be cultural based or whatever, you know, and consider what those really are. I mean, I've changed kids 2 or 3 times because they went and relapsed, but I taught it, we treated it as a relapse and not as a technical violation to say you need to go back. You don't need to go back. We need to find out what the problem really is and address that and find out who the appropriate person is to do that. I mean, that's my philosophy that I've taken. And I've really preached that and really have gotten it across to some juvenile probation and parole officers, and they haven't violated it. Says, let me work with this kid. Let's not find something else before you pull the trigger and want to send them back.
Okay, so let me ask this question, and Carol has a comment she wants to insert, but I want to ask a question. So we're on camera, and so we're not talking about New Mexico right now, okay?
In general.
In a hypothetical jurisdiction, do you tell your parole officer, look, if they test dirty, if they're using weed, it's not our expectation that you're going to violate them. You know, and I want to say, without any aspersions on my 2 young adult children, that if they got violated every time they smoked weed when they were teenagers, they wouldn't have been home a lot, okay? And I don't know that for sure. That's what I suspect. That's why there was a chair outside the back door in our backyard. That's what I think that chair was for. Okay, so we have a 20-year rule in our family that we can't really know what happened until they're 20 years past 18. So we don't know all the stories yet. But can you have that dialogue, Bob?
It's a philosophical change. It is making that change. It's making people look at things really differently. You know, we can't look at it the same as we did 10 years ago, 5 years ago. You know, it's not. Kids are different, and if we think that we're going to come in and we're going to punish them for everything that they do wrong, they don't learn anything. They keep on doing the same behavior.
So let me turn to Carol, and
So
then Lonnie, do you want to jump into? Okay.
We actually did that at La Bodega de la Familia. We made an agreement with probation and parole not to send any youth or adult back to jail and prison for a technical violation. And what it did is it changed their job. So we're really getting at culture. They wanted the kids to succeed. And the other point I wanted to tie into this, you mentioned substance use and mental illness. We do know from the literature that there's a lot of familial, correspondence to that. And we also know, as Shay said, there's adolescent behavior. Adolescents are supposed to challenge authority when they're adolescents. That's how they grow up, right? I mean, think about yourself, your own kids. I have 2 now in my 20s. I really remember this. Unfortunately, when if you take Joan Petersillia's work and you look at people's conditions, they're being watched. They're being held accountable in a way that most of our children are not. But I do think the mental illness and substance abuse is huge, and it's one reason we blame families and the communities where they come from as being part of the problem. The way I think we need to think about it is, let's look at it contextually, let's look at it ecologically, because it's very important to have the support, if you're in treatment, of somebody. And it's not somebody who you don't trust. It's got to be somebody you trust. So if you can engage an aunt, it may not be the mom, right? It may not be the brother. You ask that kid, who do you trust that can help you stay the course? And it may not be, I hate to say this, treatment. Our research showed that people succeed not because of dosage of drug treatment. They succeed because they get the support. And think about employee assistance programs. They actually rely on social networks to keep people from drinking or using drugs. So I just wanted to offer that.
Lonnie, one last comment on this issue.
Well, I just want to weigh in on the technical violation piece. That's really kind of a huge issue. In fact, our agency is right now kind of taking that on. It's really trying to do an analysis, because we really are trying to look at are a lot of youth that are coming back in really being violated for more of the technical violations instead of the ones that we know historically would automatically get you right back into our custody. And we're starting to really think that majority of them, or a lot of them, are really being violated on things like, maybe smoking weed or substance abuse. And we're starting to think we got to start looking, I think David touched on it earlier, what's the level of response we need to do, in terms of those type of, issues. And necessarily it doesn't mean they have to come back into a closed custody type of a situation. And what are the options out there in the community that we have that can maybe better address that and better meet the need of that particular individual? So that's a good question, and that's something that we're currently doing a little bit of analysis around.
Judge, final word on this question.
I think if we stick to the basic assumption that kids do best in their communities at home with services around them. If we stick to that assumption, and we're only going to send the kids to out-of-home placement if we have public safety issues, accountability issues, rehabilitative issues. Okay, so if we assume that those kids that are going to the institution cannot be served in the community, then that goes back to my initial point. We can't wait till the kid comes home to address in a very positive way substance abuse issues, mental health issues. I mean, if they were diabetic and they had insulin, you can be darn sure that they would have insulin in the institution. So we're not going to wait till the child comes home. So, and the other factor when you start talking about substance abuse, especially substance abuse and educational issues, the kids that go to the institutions are a handful. We all know that. And they're gone. And then maybe they're gone for 6 months. And 6 months is yesterday. I mean, in their lives and in the lives of the people who, their caretakers, their teachers, their substance abuse counselors, and their peers especially. And if we can develop these skills for them so that when they return to the community in a safe environment, that's why we're having these conversations in our community about day treatment, we can teach them and give them the opportunity to practice and fall down a little bit, but continue to surround them so they can make those important changes in their lives so that the sanction isn't you're going back to the institution.
Did we hit your 3 points? Yes. Okay. Next question, back in the back over here.
I'm Bill Glick from Indiana, and I just feel like I'm having a big case of deja vu right now. I started my career in substance abuse treatment, and I can pull out my material from 30 some odd years ago, and it would be a great point-by-point correspondence to what we're talking about here. But I'm glad you took off, and I'm glad Bob used the term relapse, because one of the things I see is missing if we have this analogy to what we were doing 30 some odd years ago in developing aftercare for those young people and adults who are being serviced in mostly residential treatment programs for substance abuse, is relapse triggers and relapse prevention. And Bob was the first person to introduce that term today. But one of the things that's missing, with all due respect, David, from your case management plan here, is relapse, getting kids to recognize and getting the folks around the young people to recognize and help them to identify their relapse triggers. And number two, the thinking process, which I think, and this is my question, how do we get folks in our field to understand relapse is a natural part of the process of reentry and reintegration? So my question really comes to, in your experience, how do you think we in the field can get this, to use the buzz term, paradigm shift, so that, I mean, the issue of technical violation goes back to that too. Where you know, kids smoking weed, well, you know, maybe we should expect that. We should be prepared for it. What can we do about it? What can we do to assist young people, families, and communities to help the young people identify their relapse triggers? And number two, what do we do in terms of relapse prevention and integrating, changing our thinking? This is something we should expect.
Thanks, Bill. And I think I heard in that question, not that there shouldn't necessarily be a response, but just that it shouldn't be the trigger for violation necessarily. Mm-hmm. So anyone on the panel, and I want to really make this a town hall discussion. If anyone in the audience has any reaction to any of the questions that are being posed, you're in this conversation. So I want to hear from you too.
Well,
David.
With regard to substance abuse and smoking weed in particular, I have to say that I think what's happened is when you operate in a zero-tolerance world, there's no room for any gray areas of anything. It's either good, bad, you made it, you didn't, you're a success or you're a failure. So in a zero-tolerance mentality, there's no gradations. It's one thing or another. And I think with regard to substance abuse in particular, we make terrible mistakes in that regard. It may well be that there are some young people where it is very, very common that this is what goes on. And it may well be that some of these young people, while it may be that we would prefer that that not happen, that it may not be creating problems in terms of their day-to-day functioning. Some of you are nodding your heads because you know about drug abuse assessment and treatment. Some of these young people will use it recreationally, socially, and occasionally. Now, it's an illicit drug. It's not a technical violation in some places because it's an illicit drug. It's against the law, and unless they want to go with the technical violation route because it's quicker and easier, they may have to actually bring them up on charges. They can do that. But the point is that if you want to think about if this youngster has a real problem in terms of basic functioning, are we able to get this youngster to use so much less that certain things he can now accomplish or she that couldn't before? Are they using less now than they did before? I mean, but again, that's a gray area and a nuance that in a zero-tolerance world just doesn't cut it. So I think this is what we're up against with regard to particularly substance abuse treatment and marijuana especially.
You know, David, when I hear you talk about that, I think that's right. I think in the case management that what I'd like to see us engage in, it's a balancing of, okay, I've got this substance abuse problem, or I've got this mental health issue. What are the strengths this young person has that we build upon? So there's a rebalancing in a young person's mind of hope. So I was on a call recently, actually, from some folks from Ohio, and we were talking about what some of their system improvement work might lead to. And it wasn't just having a stronger platform back home when they re-entered. It was about how all this planning and engagement and strength-focused work may actually lead them to have more hope for when they do go home may actually improve their behavior in the institution as well. That it's a total reframing. So it's not to diminish that there are mental health issues and substance abuse issues. But the way out of it isn't to, and I'm not saying you said this, David, at all, to medicate kids and then get them through their incarceration so they can go back home. And so this rebalancing, I think, is part of what we want to see happen. Carol, did you want to jump in?
No, I
okay.
mean, I would
okay.
have said the same thing.
I have a hand over here.
Yes, I'm Kwanzaa Morton. I'm from the San Francisco Juvenile Probation Department, and we have a collaborative reentry court as well that we're doing out there. One of the things that I wanted to add to the discussion is, and I'm glad to see it's a lot of directors of different probation and parole that are part of this, but as far as from the top down, it's very important to have that concept from management's perspective of, and speaking from our probation department, where we're not allowed to violate kids. It's a process, it's a multiple process. So what it does is it deters a lot of us from doing that and utilizing like alternative options as far as substance abuse, as far as different types of alternatives. And so the technical violations are lower, are lowered in response to that, because basically we're not having that available at such an easy option. So I just wanted to add that as well. Coming from the top down is very, very important. And then also being in that child's life for the majority of probation or whatever they're going through. One of the components of our program is that we're basically working with the kids from out-of-home placement, when they're committed to out-of-home placement, until they're done with their wardship probation, and even after we do some follow-up. So it's important to have those consistent people in their lives. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Great. I've got a couple hands over here, so move the mic down that way, this young woman, and then that young gentleman over there.
Good morning. My name is Tammy Eccles. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. And I have two questions. I've seen that on David. I am actually the mentoring case manager. And one of the things that I ran across is that when it comes to seeking out mentors for these individuals, because that's part of the plan also, is that a lot of the men that we're having and females have backgrounds. They have committed some kind of crimes. And I know that there's a limit of different things that they can have committed. And I know that they have a real strong heart for it. So that's a problem that I'm coming against of how do we get these young people mentors. And then the other one is that I deal with individuals from 17 and under. And now I'm trying to, because I just got 2 young men that's out, now I'm trying to find an avenue of how to approach different businesses to try to get them jobs, to be able to continue that they stay out, continue to give them positive, because they do have goals. So them are the 2 things, the mentoring and some type of information on how to approach businesses, because they do have felons.
Okay. A couple of thoughts about that from people on the panel or in the audience.
And let me talk about the felony thing, and I'm going to use an example because I had to really go to bat for a girl that committed murder. And she went into the nursing section, and the background check was going to absolutely kill her. And the NCIC, all it said was arrest. Didn't say juvenile, didn't say what the disposition was, didn't say anything else. We finally got that department to go ahead and overrule. But if she didn't have somebody out there that were really advocating and pushing for her to do that, it wasn't going to happen. Her career goal was dead, absolutely gone. Her idea was, I can't be what I want to be. I can't be a registered nurse now. But the stuff is juvenile, we can take care of some of that stuff. It doesn't follow. I'm not going to say that for every juvenile, because some of them I wouldn't go to bat for and do with, I'll tell you up front. But there are some that are extremely motivated, extremely knowledgeable, got caught in a situation, and with the advocacy and support, we support them into a good, positive, long-term career path.
And the other trigger there, Bob, is what the state laws allow or don't allow you to do. Some state laws are less flexible than others. When I heard Representative Lawler talk earlier today, it's just amazing to me how, with the swift signature of a pen on a legislation in the back in the 90s, it takes us 15 or 20 years to undo the damage that did. And there's less exigency and urgency around it than there was at that moment, where there was a generation of super predators out there, supposedly, that they were responding to. Judge.
I just want to make one comment about the mentoring. I know exactly what you're talking about, finding that perfect match for a child in need. We have with the work with the Department of Youth Services, we had an opportunity to develop a program, the wraparound program. You've probably all heard about wraparound. And these are kids that have mental health issues and then some criminogenic issues as well. What we have done, because of the same thing you're talking about, everybody needs a mentor and there just aren't enough of them. We asked the kids and we asked the family to bring someone to the first wraparound meeting that means a lot to you, someone that you would tell your biggest secrets to, somebody that you could rely on. And then we tried to bring that person in and have that person be part of our wraparound team.
Okay, Lonnie, quick comment.
Yeah, just want to respond real quickly to the mentorship piece. I think within closed custody, some of my programs, we really want to utilize mentors and volunteers to come in. We kind of like two types. One, we want them to see kind of the professional type role models that a lot of them haven't had a lot of exposure to, but we also know there's value in seeing young people or others that have overcome similar circumstances as themselves. Some of our youth have been now alumni that have been out and been productive, got back in school, got jobs that we feel very strongly about. We make some exceptions, for. We also sometimes network, and that's part of that community engagement with organizations like the Urban League, Self-Enhancement Inc., other organizations that work in the community, faith-based, to give them opportunities to come in and volunteer and provide mentorship opportunities. Even within the family, we talk about when they come out, it's ideal if you can find in the immediate family someone to be on board with the planning, but if not, you have to look for significant others. Maybe that auntie, uncle, or coach, or somebody in the community that can be a mentor or somebody that young person can relate to. Business, I love that idea. I think you got to have a strategy when you go in to engage businesses. I think you got to come in and hopefully help them understand the benefits sometimes to them by helping us help youth be productive. Because sometimes they don't know what role they can play in terms of working with the youth offender. So it's having a real strategy about helping them maybe understand the benefits, how they can be involved, also the kind of public relations, the positivity they can get for being involved. So really kind of having a strategy for how you approach business.
Great. Real quick, David, because I got a gentleman who's very patiently.
You won't believe it.
Done. Okay, your question? No. You're like an Al Gore dance move.
Shay and I worked together for far too long. With regard to mentorship and some of these prohibitions and restrictions on who can do it, let me suggest the following really quick. It seems to me that this is where the research and the evidence-based practice needs to be utilized to lobby or to otherwise convince some of these things that have found themselves codified that they need to be changed. I know there's folks here from the Center for the Advancement of Mentoring. I know they're going to have some sessions. The rest of us have a lot of experience in this. There are places you can point to that are utilizing people who have a record, who have had phenomenally sensational, positive impacts on young people. And I think what we're going to have to do is rally that evidence-based practice and that research in order to bring about changes to some of these really ridiculous restrictions that don't allow potentially some of the best people that we want to be mentors to not be eligible to be mentors.
Thank you, David. That was pretty fast, too. Okay, sir.
Thank you. So I have two questions. I'm Chris Watler, the project director of the Harlem Community Justice Center. One question is really about how you change the incentives. And what I heard you, Shay, kind of going to the kind of organizational stuff. I was interested in that because when you talk to juvenile probation officers and counselors, the idea of, not violating someone or taking a risk is, it's dependent on the individual, and the incentives seem to be misaligned in our juvenile justice system. So people actually who try to deploy these kinds of evidence-based practices in a context that is not friendly to that, often can find themselves in not such a great situation if they get a media case. So I want to talk about, I don't know if anyone has had experience changing that culture towards something that really rewards people, promotes people,
right.
For doing that. The second thing is gangs. And what does it look like in a reentry context when you're dealing with young people who are gang involved seriously, who may face issues of safety, who may not be able to get services in their community because that might expose them to victimization.
So let me talk first about the changing the culture and creating accountability. And I know that there are probably experts in the room and on this panel that may have dealt with some of the gang issue. We can turn to them. But I think you raise a really good point, because it gets back to some of what Bob started with in his comments. Changing the culture about the workforce deals with then building capacity, giving staff the tools they need to do some of this work. So if I were to say, how many people are using multidisciplinary teams in their facilities or in the community in their work? Show of hands. How many people are using team decision making that includes family members in your work? Show of hands. How many are using family group conferencing in your work with your families and kids? Different variation on a theme. How many of you are totally satisfied with the capacity of your staff to actually execute those strategies? Show of hands. A few, and that's great. And I'm not up here saying no one's got it yet. It's an evolving story. I think that what we need to do is to create the training mechanisms, create the quality assurance mechanism, so we don't just train on it and say, this is a good thing to do, now go do it. We go back and revisit it. We model the behavior. We build into their performance measures how well they're doing with their motivational interviewing. How many family conferences are they having? How many disrupted family conferences are they having? So we can create an accountability within our workforce that this is so important that our leaders live it. Someone mentioned that earlier about the leadership. And every day you're expected to execute it in a positive way. Over time, we will change some of the mentality that we can simply punish our way out of bad behavior instead of really building on good behavior on all levels. So I think that's part of my answer, at least, is build it into your workforce, build it into your performance measures, and have the QA involved, or the CQI, to help workers get better at it over time. Some of the jurisdictions I know that are working in this area, that's exactly what they're doing, either through their own institutional training or their partnership with universities that have expertise in helping them do better by this work. So any other comments about that issue before we go on to the gangs?
I just wanted to enlarge that issue, is that everybody needs the staff development. It is not just people doing clinical interaction. It's got to be the people working, if it's an institution, the people working in the kitchen, the housing officers. And I think what we've done is you really want to make sure that the whole culture is changing, not just in one piece.
And I'd be remiss not to say that sitting next to Laura is Kevin Shepard, who's the director of the Bureau of Parole. And what they've done is to say we are totally aligned in how we're going to strategize the community to family piece in what we do in our institutions. So that the whole job description of a parole officer is changing in that system to be one of, we're in the institution with the kids. We are working with the family. We're bringing the family to the institutions. We're using technology to connect the families to the institutions and their young people. That's a big shift, and it takes time to institute. So quick comment on this, Judge, and then I want to get the gang issue.
Okay. Being from Ohio, they have done a wonderful job on this, but what the department has also done is they have educated the bench, probation, on all of the programs that they are instituting, they're using, encouraging us, dispensing some of their tools into the 88 different counties. So we are all talking the same language, and it's really beneficial. Well, from my position, and I think a lot of the other judges also, that if I have an understanding of what the workers, or the line staff, I guess you would say, what their roles and responsibilities are, I can have a conversation with the child and the probation officer, parole officer, whatever the case may be, on the record to see if they're satisfying their needs and if the kids are improving. So if we're talking the same language, it's much more beneficial, I think, and they've done a wonderful job in training us on
Great.
that.
Thank you, Judge. Okay, gang issue. Lonnie.
Yeah, in regards to the gang issue, you know, with the programs I run, I'm starting the facilities, a lot of the youth are very heavily gang involved. And that's one of the reasons I've advocated over the years that it really is a treatment issue in terms of working with that particular mentality. But beyond helping them see the need, hopefully, to disassociate from gangs, it's also about encouraging them now around the social development piece, educational, etc. But it's also about spending time about the safety issues in terms of when they get back in the community. One, some of it is their personal responsibility for that. So we talk to them about things such as your dress. If you go back out, get your dress, you look like a gang member, it's going to create more problems. Neighborhoods, a lot of times they know the hot spots. If you're serious about changing, you need to avoid the hot spots. Positive peers, we try to get them involved. Many of them haven't had positive peers. So it's about getting them connected to hopefully other positive peer groups. I think as part of the overall case management piece, we also have to look at each case individually. Family, some of these guys have family members, they can't go back home because of the situation even within their own family. So I think as we work towards that case management plan, a youth that has gang issues, there's personal responsibility on their end, but also we need to look at some youth can go back to that neighborhood and be okay, and we pull some supports around and they can stay away from the hot spots. Others, we may need to look at some alternative planning in terms of maybe not in that neighborhood, but maybe is there other options, another neighborhood? Is there an uncle or aunt or program somewhere else that'll make it more conducive to his involvement in the community, which really impacts those safety issues that you're talking about. So I think it really comes down to case management to really take gang issues into consideration as you're doing that overall case planning process.
What's interesting for me about this, Lonnie, is that I think the underlying message we're getting is we need to be better at using cognitive behavioral approaches. We need to be better at motivational interviewing. So some of the techniques you're describing are really supported best if I'm a worker who understands how to use some of those techniques. And I succeed best in influencing a young person if I can help them change their thinking. One of the workshops that we put together is around adolescent brain development and pro-social development. Because the science we have now about adolescent brain development is critical in understanding how it's so important to understand cognitive approaches and motivational interviewing type approaches, because this brain is developing, and the ability to resist peer pressure and resist instantaneous decisions that are really negative can be bolstered by a worker well trained and a cluster of individuals that support that.
I totally agree. I think that is huge. I think that, to me, honestly, no matter how many, we can all are smart enough, best practice, evidence-based programming, that's out there, we've made progress, but a lot of times it's those intangibles, Shay, as you shared. To me, it comes down to individual commitment of the facilitators. Do they believe young people can change? Do young people see that they really care about their future in terms of care and concern, respect, dignity? And a lot of that is training, and it's a shift from normal type. When some people come into the corrections field, sometimes they come maybe for different reasons. Some come for because, hey, you know, it's part of our mission is accountability and public safety, and they treat their job like that. But a big part is rehabilitation, reformation, and also, again, what you're talking about, transformation with young people and so forth. So I think it's a big training curve that we want to do, too, with a lot of our staff to really be balanced, to recognize the parts that we have to recognize in relationship to our mission, but it's also about how we want them to really engage our youth in ways to assist them in being productive young people when they come back out into the community.
I want to take this back to one quick point, and actually had a question back over here, and then I'll come back to you, Bill. And Bill's the only person on this side of the room who's asked a question, so that's got to stop. But I think that this notion, the woman from Atlanta who runs the mentoring program, that asked the question before, who's writing dutifully down in her notes right now. She doesn't even know I'm talking about her. So, yeah, you. This is your life. So I think that the notion of using mentors and using non-traditional mentors around this gang issue is important. And I know it is a slippery slope, and we need to be really careful how we go there. But having individuals who have been in gangs before, who have been in the justice system before, be mentors who have moved beyond that and can influence cognitively how young people think, because they have maybe more credibility than some other people might have who are paid to do the work, per se. So I look at the project in Chicago, Operation Ceasefire, that Gary Slutkin has promoted, and I think about how delicate a balance it is to use those street workers he uses to reach out to young people in gangs on the cusp of violence, to get them to think differently about what their response should be. We need mentors, we need supporters in all sorts of different ways. We're going to the speed date stage of our session. Okay. So we got quick questions, quick answers. I've got one over here. You've been waiting patiently. Oh my gosh, I got two over here. Can you do 30-second questions? Okay.
And in our tribal area, with engaging parents, we face a lot of intergenerational issues. So it's difficult when a child comes back, a youth comes back, they're coming back into the same situation. Do you have any ideas or suggestions or practices, strategies that, that could be helpful?
Wonderful. We're going to do one answer. It's going to go to Carol. And you
yes. I mean, I think you're raising an issue that that everyone faces, and again, it's important to understand who else is in the community, in the tribal community, that is a resource, a pro-social positive one. And I think the other part is that just as youth change when they've been in institutions, so has the rest of the family system, or, you know, you don't just stop. And so I think part of that is the process of recognizing what's gone on in the lives since the child was removed. What are the strengths? Where has the child grown? And that may be the same thing for the parental systems.
And working across systems, because I think a lot of these families were known to other systems before the justice system.
Linda Rosen from OJJDP. I understand that it's preferable for reentry to begin on day one when a youth first comes into the situation that they're in. But there are some projects that are trying to work with kids who have been discharged recently. Are you suggesting that that's not a good use of time and effort and funding, or is there something they can add to their program that'll make it successful? Or
You're looking at me. Is that for me?
Yeah, sure.
David, you have the one answer. 30 seconds.
If that's all we can do, then I'd be the last one to say don't do it, but I think there's a much better way to pursue it along the lines that we've been talking about.
Okay, so this panel, for me, was great. I love this discussion. It did exactly what we wanted it to do in terms of opening the dialogue. I want to point out a couple of things before you leave this room. The workshops that we put together that support this opening make sense. So you will have, if you look at your materials, you will have workshops around adolescent brain development and pro-social connections, the role of families and social supports in reentry, the best practices in behavioral health. It's a key issue. That issue was raised right at the beginning as we opened it up for questions. Transitions to adulthood, the fact that we have this aging population. Every one of these, as well as the ones around cross-systems collaboration and integrating mentoring into your work, are designed to take what we've done right here in beginning to peel the onion and peel it back further. So every one of the sessions we've constructed and we've prepared for, those panelists are prepared to dig deeper on these issues. So I encourage all of you to participate fully in the juvenile justice track. Some of them are in competition with one another, so split your team up. And then also encourage your counterparts in the adult system who are working with young adult offenders to also think about coming to some of these sessions, because the issues are one and the same. Please join me in thanking the panel. I think they did a great job, and thank all of you.